So this particular part of the presentation is really about, it's an extension of the qualitative data coding process. So it's really, we're kind of starting to look at how we think about the definition of codes, how we think about excellent excerpts to represent those codes, and moving into categorization. So if you are survey methods or using more quantitative data, of course, this might be useful to you, but this is primarily around the qualitative, and there's a separate video for quantitative. So the first thing I want to ask is, how is the coding going? Are you having fun? And please put a little video or a little voice recording or a little comment here to talk a little bit about how it's going for you as you go through all of your data this week through the coding procedure. What are you learning as you go through? What kinds of tips can you give your colleagues? If you have questions, feel free to post them here, and I will answer them here for people who come along, but then I will also answer them in an email late so that you don't have to come back and revisit. So the agenda for this video is first to just briefly talk about revisiting our purpose. What is our purpose in the EDD program, and how does that relate to qualitative data coding? Next, I'm going to briefly talk about coding observational data, because that can be a little bit different depending on the purpose than coding interview data. Next, I'll talk about defining and refining codes to prepare you for your findings section and for the graphic organizer. And finally, the purpose and nature of doing memoing. All right, so coding observations. A few of you, maybe 2 or 3, have observational notes. For the rest of you, you may want to just look through this series of slides just so you know what might happen if you have observations at some point, or you can skip through them. So observations, you can code them the same way you code interviews. All right. So for example, Mary Kay has an observation of a meeting. You can use even the same sets of codes depending on how it looks, but you may be looking for slightly different things. So just like we saw in our social justice series, you may be looking at things like voice, how people negotiate things, the interactions and relationships between people, the positioning that people do of one another, and other power dynamics. So that's something that you may want to add to your list of things that you're looking for. You may, I'm trying to think, so Mary Kay, you're interested in the values that are represented. So I think you would still want to look for values, for example, that are represented in those meetings. But maybe thinking about, well, who gets to champion what values, for example, might be something you'd look for. In addition, researchers often use more deductive frames to code observations, and I would say especially of classrooms. So here I'm going to address some of Melissa's observations of classrooms. There are many models out there of how to code classroom data, and it very much depends on your research question. So to take Melissa's example, she might want to start with some deductive codes around standards, like what standards are they following? Do they seem to have a set of pedagogical expectations, a set of standards? Is there a set of pedagogical expectations that Melissa has taken from the literature that she's going to then evaluate them on, for example? Melissa also might want to think about a set of deductive codes that has to do with alignment with kindergarten. So maybe there's a series of types of pedagogies or engagement and learning that would align well with the transition to kindergarten, and she's looking for those specific educational opportunities. Does that make sense? So these are kinds of deductive codes that you would want to take from the literature. You have a list already, and you're going in and sort of looking for those kinds of things in the data. You might also want to take simultaneously or in addition an inductive lens and really just look at the data with an open mind. Maybe thinking about, well, what actually happens in a TK classroom? As Melissa argued, that's in her literature review, that's something that we actually know very little about. So even just starting with a very open, broad, like what kinds of things happen in these two TK classrooms might be a good way to do an inductive coding analysis of a classroom. For everyone else, just be very, very careful about coding classroom data. Be very deliberate about it. If you are going to be deductive, be clear about whether it's evaluative or not. You want to always be thinking about the purpose of your research and not get caught up in maybe a more typical administrative or leadership way of approaching a classroom observation. So there's a lot of cautions in terms of classroom observations. Because not very many of you have classroom observations, I'm not going to spend a lot more time on it. But if any of you want to know more about how to code classroom observations, let me know and we'll have a discussion offline. Another thing you may want to do as you are coding observations or as you are observing a meeting or a classroom is to count incidences of something. So in this case, this is a little example table of coding for when does a certain thing happen. In this case, when does a student reason with evidence? This is from science, of course, in response to a teacher question. When does a student reason with evidence in a peer conversation? When do they reason with evidence in a pair share, right? And so you would put tallies. Here's how many times I saw this happen, right? And there's another thing. When do I see a student applying logic to problem solving in response to a teacher question in peer conversation? So you can set up tables like this to answer, again, some of your main research questions if you're interested in differentiating the numbers of times certain things happen or different access to voice within your observational data. In another example of counting, you may actually look at different groups of people. So in this case, boys versus girls. How many times boys ask procedural questions versus girls, how many times boys versus girls ask critical questions, right? So in this case, I'm examining equity of voice in the classroom. This is one way to do it. And you can differentiate by ethnicity, age, these kinds of things as you look at voice in the classroom and you make your tallies. So that's it for coding observations in terms of the scaffolding that I will provide in this class. But again, if you have additional questions, just let me know and we can talk about it more. Now, the next couple of slides and examples is about this descriptive analysis graphic organizer. So this is something that you'll be working on in the next couple of weeks. I recommend starting on it and thinking about it even as you finalize your coding. So mostly this week you're going to be coding all of your interviews or other pieces of data, but you may want to start thinking about and start listing the codes you've been using, right? This is something that's a bit of an iterative process, all right? So step number one is start with the list of codes you've been using. You can create an Excel or a Word table. The graphic organizer I gave you is a Word table, but you can certainly use Excel. You may want to create this list of codes as you go along. And in fact, you may want to even have preliminary definitions of your codes, because as you go through, interview number 3, and you're looking at, well, what exactly did I mean by this code that said professional development agency? So you might want to have a preliminary definition, and then you will revise that definition as you go through this process. The other thing I want to make a note of here is that after you're done coding all 3 pieces of data, you will likely need to go back and recode the very first piece of data because your code set will have changed. For most people, you will at least have more codes that emerged as you looked through interview number 2 and 3, and that you want to go back and reapply to interview number 1. Like it's actually present in interview number 1, but you didn't notice it. Okay, so let's say that you've gone through that process, you've iteratively, you've coded interview 1, 2, and 3, you've taken all the codes, made sure and redone interview 1, you've gotten a list of codes and maybe some preliminary definitions that you're tossing around in your head. That is the starting place of these slides. Once you have your list of codes set up, you will want to gather all the excerpts to which you've applied that code in one place. So there's a few ways to do that. Most commonly, you want to copy, you can just copy and paste those excerpts into a Word doc so that they're all together, or into an Excel sheet. Another thing people do is they print it all out, and they cut and they paste it onto colored cards. And that's always fun for those of you who like to physically arrange things, because then you can use the interviews and move them around and group them in different ways. And you can have different colored cards. That's how I did my master's thesis, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So you'll gather all those excerpts into one place. You will read through them. So you'll read all the quotes in that, that you've put in that code. And here's a couple of things to think about as you do that. Number one, are there any excerpts that actually need to have a different code that just don't really fit that well into that code and they need to be put somewhere else? And number two, if you have, 30 excerpts or more, in many cases, they may need to be subcoded. You may notice child codes or subcategories within that code that you might want to think about. So in terms of, maybe one of my codes might be district professional development opportunities. Well, clearly there may be several different kinds of professional development opportunities, everything from going over a workbook that's available to, lesson study, right? So there's very different kinds of opportunities. I may want to subcode those excerpts. And finally, after you've read through all the excerpts, you've redone where different things belong, you write a preliminary definition of the code based on what you read in the excerpts. So here is where you will revise. If you've already written a definition, a working definition, you will revise that working definition to reflect what's really in, what you really see in those excerpts. And I would recommend, a 2 to 3 sentence definition. Like you really want to kind of get a little bit robust here. And the reason why, of course, is that then that is transferred directly into your findings later. And as you do that, you also want to notice if there's any codes that are, are really kind of two codes. So if I had a code that was like student voice and agency, maybe that's actually two different things. I want to split them into student voice and student agency and split the excerpts. Sometimes, maybe even more often, I find something that is really just the same. Like I end up coding each excerpt that's coded is coded both of those things. Then I merge those codes. Finally, once you have your list of codes, you've got your definition, your working definition, you'll look at the literature and just make a brief note. What's the relationship between your definition and the definition that you see in the literature, or the kinds of literature about this? And it's just maybe a sentence or two about this. And then finally, you want to cut and paste 1 to 3 exemplar quotes in the cell to the right of the definition. So I recommend, more than one if that's possible, because then you have several to choose from when you get to your findings. The quotes that I tend to choose are usually people who exemplify, and the way they talk about that thing, what I'm seeing across all of the others. So I tend to choose that central but very well spoken exemplar quote. But some people will choose an excerpt that is on the far end of a continuum within their code. So for example, I might look at folks who are talking about professional development as being really helpful, or professional development as being unhelpful, right? So they represent two different ways of thinking about professional development. So as an example of the last slide, this is your descriptive analysis graphic organizer. It has all those instructions, but here I just want to bring your attention to this example. I have this code, opportunity for PD, and here's the definition: reference to opportunities for science-specific professional development, right? That's a very simple definition. But see here, I would say not lesson study. So I had split this code to where I was like, you know what, lesson study is a different kind of professional development. I want to have it separately. And then I make reference to the literature. The literature seems to denote continuum of professional development from one shot to more extensive PD seems to work best. So this is just a brief description to the literature. And then an example quote, although I would recommend for you that you have between 1 and 3 quotes, or 2 to 3 quotes, so that you have a little bit more than just one. Another example, scheduling for science professional development and collaboration time was something that emerged from my data. And I defined it as scheduling issues or overcoming scheduling issues related to professional development or collaboration time. And then I wrote, there's very little in the literature related to scheduling. This may be a gap. So I looked through all the literature, you know, there's a couple of references here and there, but this is something that even though it's really important in whether or not professional development happens, that there's a gap. Now, the definition of a code is going to be fairly precise. The graphic organizer that is optional in a couple of weeks where you start pulling together themes out of your data, that's where you're going to dig in a little bit more, like what's scheduling issues, what's a list of the types of scheduling issues that came up, and those kinds of things. So just a heads up that graphic organizer, if you want to use it, is going to help you to pull those things out. I think that's it. You may want to take some time to digest the first part of this presentation. In this part of the presentation, I'm going to move into memoing and the purpose and why it's important. So you read a chapter on this and did some readings analysis. And I just want to briefly touch on a few questions. First, what is the purpose of memos? You memo, which means essentially to write your thoughts down as you analyze the data. And you memo to document emergent patterns. So essentially you're memoing, you're writing a paragraph or a few sentences to document what you notice about what's happening in the data. So what are memos about? Generally, again, what you notice about the participants, the phenomenon, the process, or the relationships between codes, any of these things. They're essentially your reflections. They can be somewhat informal language, but you may also end up referencing the literature in your memo. So they can pertain to your research question. You can say, oh, wow, like I'm really beginning to see how the values that I'm seeing encoded in the data reflect the kinds of values that I'm asking for in my research question, Mary Kay. It may reflect the literature. So Vernon, you may be seeing some themes starting to emerge that reflect on the literature regarding hidden curriculum or regarding resistance. You might be seeing some stuff around the way people talk about and frame resistance. It can pertain to the definition of code. So you would make a note like, oh, I know what this code's really about. It's about such and such. It might be patterns or themes you see arising in the data. So Rona, you may start to see certain themes from your really emergent coding process coming up. It might have to do with relationships between the codes. This is one of my favorites, where you start to see that people often mention one thing in relationship to another thing, or that one thing causes another thing, or there's a, just some kind of relationship, what's going on between those, and you'll make a note of it. And it may have to do with your future writing of your findings. So you might be like, you know what, let's organize the findings like this, this, this. So those are just some of the things that memos can pertain to. So when you write memos is any time. You can start the minute you start transcribing, and I actually highly recommend it. You also can, of course, and should be writing memos as you code, and even when you're writing up your findings. And the really most important thing about it is that you write your thoughts down, because you will forget them. And I have noticed this about myself over and over again, that I will have this idea as I'm coding, like, oh, I see the relationship between these two codes, or I see how certain kinds of participants are reflecting in a very different way than other kinds of participants. And I think, of course, I'll remember this because it was the coolest thing I've ever come up with. And in fact, 2 days later, I forget it. And I'm thinking, oh man, I thought of this really cool idea. What was it? So it's very important that you write it down and that you have a series of memos, maybe with some code words. Okay, then the great part is those memos become your findings. They become the way you write up the themes in your data. Saldana has a number of great memo examples in the book for each different kind of purpose, but I wanted to give you a couple more of my own. This first memo I would say is metaphorical, and it's kind of a big picture memo. It might help me organize my entire findings. And I wrote this. These are real from my research. This district might be represented by a metaphor of permeable membranes like cells between levels. They allow some things through and others not. Some things are allowed through one way, but not the other way: communication, resources, respect. So that might end up becoming a way that I frame my write-up about what I'm seeing in terms of communication, resources, and respect in this district. Here's another example. This is what I would call a theming memo with a key attached to a key excerpt. So I'm essentially writing up what I see as a theme. This excerpt provides an interesting example of how principals being overwhelmed by program improvement status results in delegation of authority to competent science teachers. This may be a good thing in that the science teacher experts are able to develop local policy, but it appears to also disrupt district leadership structure and communication and result in frustration. So you can see here, first of all, that I do use somewhat informal language and that's okay. But of course, when I go to write this up in findings, I would change the language to being a little bit more academic. And then this is attached somehow to an excerpt. So this was done in electronic coding format, but you can also find other ways to attach it to certain excerpts. So then this kind of a code becomes, this kind of a memo can actually become part of my write-up. So I might have a theme in my findings that says delegation of authority, or it says accountability, pressure. And then I would say something like, in several instances, the principal delegated authority to science teachers because there was a lot of pressure because they lacked science education understanding. And then I would talk about like how people mentioned the positives and negatives, and I give an excerpt quote for each one. So this memo would become a start of how I write up my findings.